Okay. We'll try to plug everyone in. I have prepared this early in the morning. I hope I haven't left too many people off. Irene, you are here. It's good to see you. My pleasure. You are coming to us from Argentina?
Indeed, I'm from Argentina, yes.
Wonderful. Yvonne,
Thank
here,
you.
of course. Leah, right? And his honor, Robert Avetizian. Excellent. I think that's, I need to include you in this. Okay. We're going to talk today about unrecognized states. And as we contemplate the puzzle of international law, there's no puzzle more complex than this map suggests. The Azeris occupy two different countries, obviously, in this split of their land, their nation. Armenia has a much more complicated situation with Artsakh, the Lakan corridor. How could this happen? It's just an anomaly of history and geography and the Soviet Union and so many influences, and not to mention oil and the revenues coming from Baku. This was taken from the news this morning. I'm sure you've seen it. A huge convoy of humanitarian products, goods, food headed for Nagorno-Karabakh, and it's been stopped by the Russian peacekeepers, I take it, yes?
No, already at the checkpoint.
Azeri checkpoint. Okay, well, obviously, I'm the moderator and not the expert, and we're surrounded by two or three experts in this area, and it's just a tragic area. We will also reference from time to time other unrecognized states. Sorry, thank you. It's a mess. Palestine. What do we say? And especially with the news of people protesting in Jerusalem, not to mention we all have seen so much of the destruction in Palestine. There's another area that fits in this category, and it's a Republic of Northern Cyprus. A story in international law that almost defies belief, but that's another thing we will talk about today. So with that in mind, I would like to just simply take us to our specific topic. We're examining the tensions between traditional conception of public international law as rules governing relations between states that recognize each other, and the more recent consensus around the universality of human rights of and for all peoples. The questions facing unrecognized and partially recognized states in representing their isolated communities and international organizations, and extending to them the protection of international human rights conventions are manyfold, and they are listed here. This was written, of course, by Levan, who is an expert in this area, much more than I am. We all know that there are some rights, erga omnes, that it doesn't matter where you are. It doesn't matter. I mean, genocide is wrong anywhere you go, no matter what the convention, the treaty, or whatever. I laugh with my grandchildren about piracy, of course, because they think that's really funny. But piracy is not funny, and it's never been funny, and it's always been illegal, and they hang pirates. And so as we look at what's going on in some of these communities, I suggest as the moderator that we will contemplate erga omnes rights, just fundamental humanitarian rights of human beings, no matter where they are. So with that in mind, I will hand off to you, Levon, if that's appropriate. And it's certainly nice to meet you after all of this conversing back and forth, and everyone. And I hope I get to see you the next time in Armenia. It would be my pleasure. And hello, Leah. I didn't mean to leave you out of all this. Okay, please.
Very well. I have an echo.
I'll mute.
Okay.
Will that help? I think it will.
You can also just mute my
Yeah,
speaker
okay.
and that works fine.
Whatever.
Okay. Does everyone on the Zoom here hear me okay? Okay, great. My name is Levon Govindichin. I practice international disputes at Evershed Sutherland, primarily international investment law, but additionally also public international law and business and human rights advisory work.
And I will interrupt immediately, of course. I think we're recording.
Yes.
Is everyone okay that we record? Yeah, I certainly am. Good. And we had talked about our idea to possibly memorialize the concepts here in a publication, in an article, so we can think about that as we progress. And I receive emails all the time soliciting articles. It's certainly no problem. So many outlets for our expression. So forgive me.
So I just want to give a brief introduction to how I think the panel might run today. We have a few different topics that each of our panelists sort of has a specialized focus on and will be presenting on, but we're also have the benefit today of a special guest, permanent representative of the Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh to the US, Mr. Robert Davitisian, who, although by training is not a lawyer, he is de facto the government representative to the US and can speak to the practical and often legal realities faced by Nagorno-Karabakh, so that we have a factual context for the discussion, for the otherwise legal discussion we're having today. The rest of the panelists will be speaking on specific topics, but I wanted to maybe start with a very brief discussion of why we're combining two different bodies of international law. One is human rights law and one is the law of state recognition. And so in essence, what's the connection, right? So it's interesting because the UN, if you go to the UN's website, they have a very prominent page about human rights, and how they define human rights is rights inherent to all human beings, regardless of race, sex, nationality, ethnicity, language, religion, or any other status. They include the right to liberty, to life, freedom from slavery and torture, freedom of opinion and expression, right to work and education, and many more. Everyone is entitled to these rights without discrimination. So the UN represents the sort of the consensus of the states that make up the world, or at least the recognized states that make up the world, and they have come together and agreed that these are rights inherent to everyone as humans.
If you don't have yourself unmuted, the camera will always point to Pat. So
Oh, goodness.
switch the system. You have to unmute yourself, and then Pat has to mute himself.
It's much better on a handsome young man than.
So you have to put yourself there so that one can.
Am I muted?
I just think Pat the whole time.
Oh, have you? Has the audience not been able to hear?
Can you mute me?
Can you hear me? On Zoom? I'm heard on Zoom? Okay, great. So starting with the premise that human rights belong to everyone, we then get to the quandary of state recognition. Now, we have many different authorities in the world that govern different territories. By and large, most of the world's territory is administered by a state that is recognized by the other states and the other recognized states. So there's a network sort of states that recognize each other and deal with each other in diplomatic relations, economic relations, et cetera, and that system kind of stems from, I guess, the Treaty of Westphalia in the late Middle Ages, where an international law was recognized that although states are sovereign within their own territory, they treat each other also. Inherent in that domestic sovereignty is a respect and deference to each other in terms of what happens within their respective borders. So the idea was the world is divided up into territories that belong to a recognized sovereign, and each sovereign is responsible for what happens within their territory. And for matters that cross territories, the sovereigns themselves deal with each other. So in the past, when before modern conceptions of human rights, you had conceptions of protection of aliens being nationals of other states. So if one alien was visiting if a national of one state was visiting another, then he was entitled to certain protection of property rights, or if he was a consul to, or diplomat protection, of like diplomatic immunity and other kinds of matters that eventually became codified in the diplomatic convention, the consular convention. But in essence, anytime one state did wrong to the national of another state, they were seen to be doing wrong to the home state where the national was from, and it created a dispute between those two states. Now, human rights as a fundamental and universal right kind of flips that system on its head, because all of a sudden you have direct relations between sovereign states and individuals. Individuals used to be excluded from the plane of human rights because their claims were seen to belong to their home state. So the home state would choose whether to press them, to seek redress, to use them as grounds for war, or whatever else. So human rights flipped that on its head. And then now, additionally, we have more and more territories that are not administered by a recognized state. And that's where today's question arises. If we accept the premise that individuals living in those territories have the same human rights that every other individual has, how are those human rights practiced? And does the system of state recognition infringe or create a vacuum for enforcement of those rights because it excludes the only jurisdiction that actually has power to monitor and police in those territories from participating in accessibility and accountability mechanisms for human rights. And so I think throughout this discussion today, as I mentioned, we'd have the benefit of the factual experience of Nagorno-Karabakh. And I think to put that in context, it might help to have a few minutes discussion about what Nagorno-Karabakh is and the situation there.
You're right. Sure. Thank you. It is you. Knowledge to share this. I know.
Sorry, Robert, can I pause you for just a second? Can the Zoom panelists here? Do you have the Zoom link?
Do I? Okay. And
I haven't muted myself. You hear me? Hmm? Turn on the camera. Okay. But do you see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, and let me just choose the way. Trying to enter the full screen mode. Okay. Yes, as I was saying, thank you so much. It's a very, I think, very timely and important discussion, because the less we speak about these issues, the more problems they create, and the more problems those affect human lives of more and more people around the world. I'm one of those who is on the other side, on the consumer side of the lack of that action. We have felt it throughout generations. Very briefly, I'll go through what is Artsakh, where it is, how political processes intertwine with the legal action and inaction, and how those inaction lead to overall tragedy, both on human life and uncertainty on political sphere. After that, if you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to take them. So it's it's a very tiny entity, population 150,000 according to 2018 estimates. Today's numbers are different for various objective and subjective reasons. We can get to that. Armenian Christian Apostolic. The capital city is Stepanakert, Fika. Okay, and the neighbors are Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Iran. This is what we call a tough neighborhood, really. So as an international dispute, this issue emerged in 1918, not in 1988, as many think, but in 1918, when the Russian Empire disintegrated. And for the first time, Azerbaijan appears on the political map as a sovereign country. Armenia and Georgia restore independence in that part of the Caucasus, in the South Caucasus, namely. Azerbaijan forms the state with the support of Turkey, of course, and put claims on certain Armenian and territories and also belonging to other countries. But the League of Nations, the antecedent of the UN, does not recognize Azerbaijan because it did not meet with the criteria which later were used as the Montevideo Convention conditions for the state to be recognized as such. It did not have clear borders. It did not have the history of statehood that can be taken as a baseline or as the historical background for that country. It did not have a clear population. It was comprised of several big and small ethnic groups. So League of Nations did not recognize Azerbaijan, neither it recognizes Azerbaijani claims towards Artsakh. And this situation of uncertainty with respect to Nagorno-Karabakh, or Artsakh as Armenians have been calling it for centuries, lasted until the 1920, when the Sovietization of the South Caucasus begins, and the Soviet Empire kind of begins to shape up and to expand in the South Caucasus. Joseph Stalin, the guy nobody loves, but some people and governments try to support his actions and political decisions. He decides that the Christian Armenian entity of Artsakh, which has been for millennia before that part of Armenia, has to be placed into the newly created Azerbaijan. We know why it was done. It was a policy of divide and conquer. It was a policy of weakening Armenians in the region, which were always throughout the Soviet history regarded as the unstable element and potentially the freedom-loving and a nation which would demonstrate freedom aspirations. So that was a very unique situation when distinct nation, which has different religion, different cultural set, different worldview, if you wish, was forcefully placed without asking for our opinion into the newly created country as part of the Soviet Union. It's very important, I think, from a legal point to consider that independent Azerbaijan never had Artsakh as recognized as its territory. 1918 to 1920. That's the only part when Azerbaijan existed before Sovietization. It did not include Nagorno-Karabakh. Armenians fought against that decision to be incorporated into Soviet Azerbaijan, and as in compromise in 1923, the autonomy for Nagorno-Karabakh was established, which already meant that we organically did not belong to that republic. Freedom aspirations continued throughout the Soviet period. It's very important to know that the determination of Nagorno-Karabakh to reunite with Armenia were not silenced. There were attempts to silence it, but they repeatedly appeared through 30s, 40s, 60s, and 70s during the Soviet Union. But those of us from us who know the region and the history and the Soviet system itself, the communist system, know that there was a declared policy of brotherhood between nations, and any claim or calls for human rights, democratic aspirations were very severely suppressed, and everybody was silenced, people put in jail, and the movement suffocated. There was a very tough policy against Armenian presence in Nagorno-Karabakh, which was even acknowledged by Azerbaijani leaders during the Soviet period. Economic and demographic situation in the NKO was not improving. It was not developing. It was not paid the proper attention. We felt that it was a policy of demographic change also of the Armenian population there. 97% of Armenian population shrank to 71% by 1989. The opposite, the 3% of Azerbaijani population increased sevenfold. So the clear policy, which was also voiced by Aliyev Sr., who is the father of the sitting president, because they have this relation of father to son hierarchy and transition of power in Azerbaijan pretty much since 1968. Gorbachev's era, when Gorbachev came to power, he said that he declared perestroika and glasnost. People were allowed to speak more freely about the subject which had been previously tabooed. Artsakh Armenians, of course, again, said the demands, the appeals, legal and legitimate, and through peaceful rallies solely. In response, we had pogroms throughout Azerbaijan, hundreds of miles away from Karabakh proper, which kind of became another signal that this is not going to be a civilized fight. And Moscow's response was very delayed. The communist Moscow's response was very delayed, very passive, which kind of led to repetition of anti-Armenian pogroms throughout then Azerbaijan. And in 1988, that was the time and the year when our legislature, which did have such authority, legally appealed before Armenian Soviet authorities, Azerbaijani Soviet authorities, and Soviet authorities in Moscow to transfer NKAO, Nagorno-Karabakh autonomy, from Azerbaijani Soviet under Armenian Soviet administration, and for Moscow to validate the deal. Predictably, we did not get the okay from the decision-making capitals, except for Armenia, of course. Baku and Moscow said no to that. Soviet Union begins to disintegrate by the 90s. And actually, Nagorno-Karabakh freedom movement has been perceived by many as the movement, the first democratic movement in the Soviet area, which sparked similar processes across the area and eventually led to dissolution of the Soviet Union. Soon after our legal fight resumed in 1988, we had similar movements pretty much across the USSR. Soviet Union disintegrates, Soviet republics, including Armenia and Azerbaijan, seek independence in 91, which opens the doors for us to seek independence, because unlike the administrative transfer of an autonomy from one Soviet republic to another, this process, the process of self-determination, did not require Moscow's okay. And there was a law in the USSR constitution which provided that if a republic declares intention to withdraw from Soviet Union, all autonomies have their rights through popular referendum or any mechanism to determine their political and administrative status. Azerbaijan, August 30, 1991, declares intention to withdraw from Soviet Union. September 2, 1991, later, in line with that legislation, we proclaim formation of the Nagorno-Karabakh Republic. Then there was a war from 91 to 94, which ended with ceasefire between Artsakh, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. Since 92, the conflict has been dealt with by the OSCE Minsk group, so there was international presence since 1992. The Minsk group, the so-called OSCE Minsk group, has three permanent co-chairs: United States, Russia, and France. Since 94, there was a kind of relative peace and stability period, which allowed us to prove that the movement, which has been always based on demand for rights and democratic aspirations, we have the opportunity, we have the capacity and the determination to continue that path. So Artsakh, unlike, probably we'll get to that point, that how you validate that unrecognized state doesn't have any international large presence, how do you say that it's democratic or undemocratic, etc. We did our best to show to the world that we were open to the world. We always were inviting everyone. It was the easiest and the most open procedure to enter Artsakh. You were allowed to enter even without visa, as long as you had it on the way out. And that was absolutely zero bureaucracy, very easy to get in there, very safe to travel around. And the economic prosperity was also shaping up. Artsakh has become energy self-sufficient based on renewable energy, which is very important. We were food self-sufficient. We were exporting food, processed food, energy, and yes, we had also mining. But there was a vision, and we did not fail our test for independence. That's one of the things which allows us to say that. And democratic development was also there. We had hundreds of US, European, of course, we mostly focused on democratic countries with strong democratic traditions. We had observers, and they were always present during the elections. Azerbaijan, Turkey, and terrorist groups from Middle East attacked Artsakh in 2020. We had pretty much a coalition of several countries ganged up against us. It was another tragic page. It is another tragic page in the history of Artsakh, which has been pretty much fighting throughout its history to remain Armenian, part of the Armenian world. International reaction was very active, but not active enough to prevent the hostilities from happening, especially considering that Turkey was hands-on. Turkey as a NATO member, that's a very, very dangerous precedent. When a NATO member was out, the collective decision of the NATO countries, etc., it oversteps over its international accepted abilities and allowances, and tries to promote its international agenda the way they see it. They even involved thousands of international terrorists from Middle East. They transported it, including using, well, actually this information has to be proved, but we are currently looking into the technical capacities. What part of NATO equipment has been used to pretty much involve international terrorism into fighting in the South Caucasus against Artsakh. This is a very dangerous precedent. This is not the first time Artsakh has been fighting against international terrorism. The first time was in 1992 when Afghan Mujahideens were hired by Azerbaijan to fight against us. So the history repeating itself, and the lack of international condemnation, the universal condemnation, really, in our case, demonstrates that it can repeat, and it can repeat with a bigger scale and inflict much bigger human suffering. Ceasefire statement has been signed on November 9, 2020, which kind of implies that the statement is the lightest diplomatic paper. It implies that there should be continuation. So currently there are discussions on various levels on how to make this process go on. The consequences are devastating for us. We lost, again, thousands of lives. Territorial losses are significant, and they threaten the security. This is one of the issues that kind of stresses the urgency of international action. Post-war restoration, we tried to restore, and actually the state has been demonstrating pretty impressive level of state resilience, meaning that the ability to restore after problems, yes. But there is a blockade. The blockade imposed by Azerbaijan since 2022, since December, the blockade has a very heavy human toll. People fight for daily bread, 120,000 people, 30,000 kids, thousands of people with disabilities, and Azerbaijan just openly ignores calls from the international community, from all the governments. They ignore the verdict by the ICJ, which has ordered twice Azerbaijan to open the road. And currently they're trying to suffocate and force us into accepting Azerbaijan's authority over Nagorno-Karabakh. But we know that it will be a second Armenian genocide, so that's out of question for us. The prospects for peace. We think that we are important, and we are important for the regional security paradigm. International recognition is on a different level. For the lack of time, I'm not going to get into this, but we do have relations, not with the state per se, not the full-fledged, but on the state level, for instance, 12 states in the United States, states in Australia, in European countries. So whatever benefits can be squeezed without having seat at the UN, we're doing it. We're not waiting for the ability or the maturity of the international legal system to accept us as a country. Our vision is that we want to continue living in our homeland as Armenians and as a country which will be open and tolerant towards everyone. We don't hate anyone, and we don't poison our population with hatred towards any other nation, be it neighboring or globally. Thank you very much for your attention and your patience. Thank you.
Thank you. Here. You mentioned two interesting points I want to build on. One was you mentioned, whatever you can do without a UN seat, and so Professor Hug earlier mentioned Palestine, and Palestine presents an interesting example because Palestine is not a UN member, but in 2012 was granted UN observer status, and since then, especially in 2014, used that platform to subscribe essentially to participation under a variety of UN human rights treaty mechanisms. Although human rights are fundamental, the UN has these core treaties that elaborate those human rights and create mechanisms for monitoring, for defining the state's obligations with respect to those human rights, but also for monitoring compliance with those human rights. And so, although Palestine, which is a partially recognized state, because I think over 100 UN members do recognize it as a sovereign, as a representative of, the state of Palestine, whether existing now or in the future, and deal with the Palestinian authorities in that context. It's still not a UN member state, but it is now participating in these UN human rights monitoring mechanisms where individuals and other states and NGOs can submit reports on instances of human rights violations, and those bodies can monitor how those violations are remedied or treated, or whether they occur, and thereby develop sort of an accountability mechanisms for Palestine to be responsible for human rights violations within its territory. So that this comes back to the bucket of not just UN membership as a point of interest in relation to human rights, but also state recognition, state-to-state recognition. And the other point I think ties very nicely into one of our next topics. You mentioned Nagorno-Karabakh is crucial for regional security. And as you mentioned, since '92, the mandate for resolution of the conflict is with the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, right? The OSCE. And if I may now introduce our next panelist, Professor Leah Calabro at GWU, to speak on
universal jurisdiction.
No,
we're leaving not quite yet. Yeah. We will get there. We're sort of zooming in, zooming out. We're starting locally with one focus, then zooming out to the region, and then looking at the wider, the rest of the recognized state world, and then finally to non-state actors. So next, Professor Calabro will be talking about neighbor states and regional political and security organizations and their responsibilities.
Can everyone hear me on Zoom? I'm hoping. Yes. Okay, great. So I'm going to start by talking about, as Levin said, the relationships between the actual recognized states in the region where recognized state is placed, as well as relationships between the unrecognized state and different interstate organizations. So I'm going to leave the specific of ARTSOC to Robert, but I'm going to talk more generally and maybe offer some other examples. So just on the outset, I want to note that each unrecognized state is in its own unique situation. So we have an expert on one particular, but other unrecognized states have come into being differently, have different relationships with their neighboring states. They have different paths to recognition and different relationships with the international community. So no, it's hard to discuss patterns because there aren't necessarily really strong patterns, but I'm going to try. So the general patterns, first looking to unrecognized state and the recognized state that it either used to be part of or that it's still, this recognized state still stakes a claim to that region, that it is still part of its sovereign territory. So historically speaking, we have examples following decolonization in which former colonizing states willingly signed agreements, allowed these states to come into being to then be its own sovereign autonomous territory. But that's not really the case anymore today. So looking to modern cases of unrecognized states, it's more likely that it's way more contentious. And so there are a lot of difficulties. If an unrecognized state is trying to gain recognition through violence, then that's going to become a whole blockade to recognition because the international community is not going to recognize that. But if there are other attempts, like diplomatic attempts throughout history of attempting to get that recognition, attempting to get that independence, then that is the approved way of gaining independence according to the international community. But I'm going to use Abkhazia as an example. So in that case, Georgia is the country to which is still claiming that it is part of its territory. And so this type of situation makes it much more difficult because the international community has already recognized Georgia. They've already recognized that you are a state. These are your territorial boundaries, and Georgia is a member of the UN. So there's a lot more difficulty in giving recognition to Abkhazia because they're pulling away from a greater sovereign that already has that international recognition. And if the international community recognizes Abkhazia, there can be claims that whatever states do that are infringing on the sovereignty of Georgia. So there's a lot of really difficult contradicting powers in situations like this. So it really becomes challenging for that state to gain that recognition. And then another case that you sometimes have with these claiming recognized states is that they play a role in further trying to disrupt and destabilize the unrecognized states. So I think that that's something that can be said of ARTSOC. They're, rather than allowing the unrecognized state to grow and to become a more viable, independent, grow their economy, grow their diplomatic relations, they're coming in and inflicting violence and infringing upon human rights and violating all of the treaties that they actually are a signing member of. So in that case, I think that it should, I don't know why the international community isn't stepping in and saying these states that are recognized states that we have recognized, we have said you have these responsibilities to human rights. You're clearly violating them. Maybe it's not in your territory per se, but you are engaging in human rights violations. I don't know why we are not using the mechanisms available to us to go after those situations. Like you can say that Georgia is, in the case of Abkhazia, is definitely causing destabilization and violating human rights, and nothing is coming of it. So I'm not sure really why we're not taking advantage of that power, but that is just the reality of the situation at the moment. And then we also have recognized states that act as protectors, or could also be known as patron states of unrecognized states. That's another relationship that we have. So these states actually help the unrecognized state with their inevitable instability and to grow and to gain recognition. There are ongoing debates as to whether or not certain patron states are actually creating puppet states rather than independent recognized nations. An example of this is Russia to Abkhazia. So there are some people who say that Russia is using Abkhazia to promote its own agenda and to try to just gain more power in the region. But that, I think, is an ongoing debate. And in addition to providing aid and recognizing the state itself, these states advocate for recognition of these territories. I think, going back to the topic of our panel, arguably these states that are acting as patron states, if they can be shown as being puppet states, then those recognized states can be liable for the human rights violations happening in the territory. That's not something that has ever been attempted to prove or go after, but I think that that should be investigated further as an option, because if you have a recognized state who has these human rights responsibilities and liabilities that is claiming some type of relationship to this territory, why can't we circuitously protect the human rights of the individuals by going through that recognized state? I don't know. That's just a thought. That's my personal opinion. That has not really been dived into, but that's something that I want to look into. So there are many other relationships that can arise, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to move into the unrecognized states with the different organizations of states and diplomatic unions. So right off the bat, typically unrecognized cannot join military alliances. That's just the nature of their being. It really has not ever happened. So this leaves them all the more reliant on those patron states for aid and protection. It also leaves them vulnerable because there's no norm of non-intervention for an unrecognized state. So international, other states in the region can invade. They're not technically violating international law unless it's maybe against the state claiming that this region is still part of their sovereign territory. But that also leaves the unrecognized state very vulnerable to that claiming territory, claiming recognized state coming in and inflicting all sorts of violence and human rights violations, because you're not infringing on another state's sovereignty if you're within your own territory. That's how the international community and international law kind of treats that situation, but I don't think that that's right, and that we need to create some way of regulating that. And if that's the case, then it's the recognized state that's responsible for those violations. But looking to different regional organizations, I think that that's really interesting to look into because they all handle it differently. So the African Union, for instance, has accepted membership of a state that's not recognized by the UN General Assembly. It's called the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic. The EU, on the other hand, in 2022 denounced human rights abuses and essentially what is seen as the infringement on Georgian sovereignty by Russia in regard to Abkhazia and South Ossetia, because Russia has been acting like the patron state. So they're saying that the EU, the European Court of Human Rights, all of them continue to recognize this. So they are saying that this is not right. They're engaging in a non-recognition and engagement policy. So essentially they're attempting to use their soft law powers to get these territories to cede to Georgia. Their stance on it, they say that these unrecognized states are not independent. The EU also in 1991 developed guidelines on the recognition of new states in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union. And these guidelines specifically require new states to have respect for the Charter of the United Nations. They need to have a commitment to law, democracy, and human rights. And they need to have guarantees of rights for ethnic and national groups and minorities. So these are all prerequisites to recognition as of 1991, according to the EU. But that leaves, again, states in which other states are interfering and causing all of this turmoil and human rights abuses to take place. It's harder for those regions to then gain that recognition because they're being interfered with. And then on the other hand, the Organization of American States in Article 12 of its charter says that the political existence of the state is independent of recognition by other states. Even before being recognized, the state has the right to defend its integrity and independence. So arguably the OAS takes the strongest stance of support to unrecognized states by granting it that right within its charter. But we don't really see that many situations coming up to. Okay. I'm like, I'm done. Oh, yeah, yeah.
Is that related to the, as an exception, or does the OAS practice, is that an exception to the exception to the non-intervention norm?
Yeah, yeah. So this is like the one situation in which you see they're actually granting the power for an unrecognized state to defend itself. Yeah, you don't really see that. It's like the unrecognized states that are really coming up today are mostly happening in Africa and Europe and, you know, near Russia, those regions. So yes, they grant more capabilities, but it's not really helping any of the current states that need that recognition. And then several of these groups do claim to be engaging in monitoring. So the EU, the OAS, and the African Union, whenever they have unrecognized states, they say that they are continuing to monitor because they want to ensure that when recognition comes as a possibility, they're aware of what's going on and they can say whether or not recognition should be permitted. And so like they encourage the de facto governments to abide by human rights instruments and often to return to their parent country. That does seem to be the ongoing dialogue between these organized groups and unrecognized states, other than the OAS. But it's definitely falling short. The fact that we're not seeing anything come of these monitoring mechanisms, they're not doing anything about it. They're just taking note. Yes, they're documenting evidence that these things are happening, but nothing is coming of it. I think that's a great question. I don't think that they even really publicize how, yeah, it's happening.
Council, you're parliamentary assembly resolution from 2006 that famously declared sort of Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and then Karabakh, and non-member Belarus to be black holes of human rights monitoring, because it said we don't have the ability to obtain reporting from it, monitoring from it, but at the same time, Belarus aside, the rest of them are not able to join the organization to be able to provide that. So I think there's almost two conflicting norms on practice by the recognition. One is the norm against recognition of possession, the anti-secession norm, and then the other is the human rights. And it's the ball in their court. Yeah, so it strikes me as like the ball is very much in the court of the recognized states to how to square those conflicting norms. The one is the anti-secessionist norm, and the other is the norm for universality and monitoring of human rights. Yeah, this just it strikes me as very action is lies with the sovereign states.
Yeah, it's definitely an ongoing issue, and I think I'll just briefly touch upon the CSO NGO. That really is where we're getting most of our information from, because there's all of these complicating factors for recognized states and all these organizations to actually gain access to these regions. So rather it's the NGOs and CSOs who are engaging in fact-finding missions and who are publishing reports of human rights abuses in these areas. And we're reliant on that to actually know what's going on here and to know what abuses need to be addressed. Yeah, well, I'm going to end there. Yeah.
A question for Robert. A question for Robert. Nagorno-Karabakh Republic has its own ombudsman, correct?
Yes.
And Armenia has its own ombudsman. Do they participate in the same, an ombudsman, a human rights defender, receives complaints of human rights violations within the relevant territory and has the responsibility of addressing them? Do you know whether the Armenian ombudsman has any jurisdiction for human rights violations in Nagorno-Karabakh, if he receives them or he or she receives them? And also, how does the Nagorno-Karabakh ombudsman, does he have any de facto opportunity to report on violations or redress mechanisms? What is your jurisdiction's experience?
That's a question. Well, the Ombudsman Institute, I don't know where you are with it. It's very independent. The state has to finance it, but the state doesn't have any control over the office. So in terms of raising awareness about the human rights violations in Nagorno-Karabakh, yes, they have all the instruments, they have staff, and they have access to all the, nobody can say no to the ombudsman office, to the access to penitentiary, etc. It's everywhere. They have access to all these things. Domestically, yes, sure. Internationally, the ombudsman, as far as I know, is trying to use all available mechanisms, which you'll be surprised, but it's very much politicized. And this is not a governmental structure. But one of the conduits to deliver the situation on human rights. The Ombudsman of Artsakh does cooperate with the Ombudsman of Armenia office. They issue joint reports, and that's also one of the ways how we are trying to use the availability of Armenian ombudsman's access to international structures. There was a period of time, I have to double check on what's going on today, but I know that Artsakh Ombudsman has been accepted as a member of the International Association of Ombudspeople. Then even there, we have seen a very strong opposition and demarches by Azerbaijan and its supporters to say that, you know what, no, we cannot accept that this person is also sitting in the area. So the level of non-recognition is not only on the level of political entity, but also on the human level. So even the person who is not politicized is facing opposition on delivering the situation with the human rights on the international arena. That's actually also another problematic spot when we just mentioned that example with the legislation.
Yeah,
One side, they don't know what's going on. From the other side, whoever is not a politician guy, you don't want to talk to representatives, that's fine. But this guy who has been elected and appointed by the National Assembly to speak for human rights, they're not such an opportunity. And Armenia doesn't have the authority to represent the kind of human rights to work in the Artsakh's legal sphere or political sphere. We have two separate entities. We have our own government, which is slightly different from Armenian government. We have our own system of administration.
I think that goes back to Professor Calabro's earlier question about why don't protector states do more? Because if the recognized sovereign state in whose territory it falls, you know, is oppressing rights or is not communicating with the local authority, then, you know, the next question is what about the protector state? And I think in Armenia's case, every state, every region is different, but in Armenia's case, Armenia doesn't have universal jurisdiction and extraterritorial jurisdiction yet, actually. So they cannot, and under their law, their territory ends at the recognized boundary of Armenia, which does not include Artsakh, because Armenia does not recognize Artsakh as part of Armenia, and Artsakh doesn't consider itself part of Armenia either. So there is a legal hurdle for de facto, for actual, you know, exercise of jurisdiction. You mentioned there's cooperation between the human rights defenders so that there's an avenue for reporting or selective reporting, I guess, to regional bodies. But that gets us, I guess, to the next panel topic, which is zooming out a little bit further. What about the rest of the world? And what about places that do have, you know, extraterritorial jurisdiction? And with that, I'd like to introduce participating remotely, but no less significantly, Professor Irene Massimino.
Thank you, Levon. Good morning to everyone.
We missed the first couple seconds. Could you restart?
I just said thank you, Levon. Thank you very much for this invitation and making it possible for me to at least be here virtually. I would have liked to be there in person, of course. The exchange is always much better. And I was thinking of the different interventions of the panelists. Thank you, Patrick, Professor Patrick Hoop, for your introduction. Actually, you mentioned something very relevant, that when one looks at this part of international law, it's like a puzzle with missing pieces. Actually, there are gaps, or as we call it in Argentina, in our legal system, there are lakes and big ponds of water where we actually can drown if we are not strategic enough when we think of what to do in these particular situations. I was thinking of Leah Calabro's intervention as well, and her mentions of OAS, and I started thinking of, that's part of, I'm from Argentina, and the US is part of the OAS as well. And as we all recognize the principles, whether that could become part of customary international law, for example, if we can think that there is enough requirement for that. Anyway, so I wish I were there to participate more actively in the discussion. It's a little bit difficult always via Zoom. So I'm here to talk, and also I wanted to also mention that unfortunately international law is very political. So whenever we looked at judicial or juridical answers or legal answers, we have to look at the politics of the region. Unfortunately, the war of aggression against Ukraine has make it more difficult for Artsakh, for the situation of Artsakh, as European countries are actually getting gas from Azerbaijan now, so they're kind of turning their back on the situation, the current situation, and the blockade. So, and there are a lot of politics. There is a huge issue of enforcement. We see with the ICJ, for example, resolution to lift the blockade that has been going on for over 7 months now, and there is no enforcement over that resolution that came out in February of this current year, actually. So what I'm going to talk about, or try to talk about, and I would love to have questions afterwards if there are any, it's about one principle and one aspect of international law, which is actually applied extraterritorially. As you all know, the principle is territoriality when we talk about general jurisdiction or other protection of human rights, etc. The general principle of international law is territoriality. So it's states who are obliged or states who have the power to exercise a specific jurisdiction. But there are some exceptions, maybe arising prior to the end of the Second World War and the building of a new international legal system, actually, because the first concept of international universal criminal jurisdiction was in the Lotus case with the Permanent Court of Justice. But in any case, it's really the creation of the United Nations, the new human rights treaties, etc., that kind of open up the way to this principle of universal jurisdiction and to extraterritoriality in some cases. So this is kind of like the trying to put in practice all of the international concepts that we think about when we talk about international law, and also that we've been exchanging in this particular case. As the different panelists have mentioned, the situation of Artsakh is very complicated. It's a territory who's not recognized internationally, unfortunately, although that is not a requirement, in my opinion, but the fact that the requirement of establishing international relations is, it can pose a threat. The other problem is the self-determination is not clearly defined. How the process of self-determination goes, it's not clearly defined. Maybe we could talk about remedial secession, etc., but how to protect the rights of the people in Artsakh is really the main question here. So one of the possibilities is through universal jurisdiction. Although it's a general principle, and as I mentioned, in international criminal law, it was the first time it came in the Permanent Court of Justice was in the Lotus case, I think it was in 1927, regarding Turkey, a coalition of vessels of Turkey and France. It's also mentioned in the 1949 Geneva Conventions, where all state parties to the Geneva Conventions take the obligation to investigate to investigate the perpetrators and the commissions of crimes of individuals who have committed crimes in breach of the Geneva Conventions. So there is a generality of this principle of universal jurisdiction, and I think even if some countries don't recognize it in practice, we could start talking about customary international law, in my opinion. In any case, I come from a country that does recognize universal jurisdiction. And I will briefly mention what it is. I don't want this to be a law class, but more of an exchange and what actually can be practically done to protect the people of Artsakh in particular, but in other countries, I don't know, the Sahrawis were mentioned here. Of course, it's not fully related to the rights of self-determination or a state, but more to human rights and international crimes. But however, I think it's a very relevant venue and a very useful venue for this cases. So Argentina, the country where I'm from, recognizes universal jurisdiction. The principle universal jurisdiction is the principle that triggers an extraterritorial jurisdiction without any links, whether the person, the act, or territory, nationality, anything, or the property, to the jurisdiction that would be a trigger or that would open to investigate and eventually try an individual in the criminal justice system. The idea is that the crimes committed are so atrocious that they threat values of the entire humanity, and perpetrators are osti humani generis or humani generis, which is they commit crimes against the entire humanity and not just to the individuals that are the direct victims of this particular crimes. So the Argentina, such as Germany, again, you probably heard of some cases against ISIS members in Germany that had no German nationality, actually, and also Sweden, Holland, I believe, accept the principle of universal jurisdiction. Argentina accepts it in its own constitution, actually, Article 118 of the Argentine Constitution recognizes the principle of universal jurisdiction, and also the adoption with the hierarchy of a national law, not constitutional hierarchy, but of a national law of the Rome Statute, also allows Argentina to open universal jurisdiction, and also the recognition of some human rights treaties with constitutional hierarchy, that means are equal to our constitution in Argentina, allows Argentina to trigger universal jurisdiction. So unfortunately, when the war started in September of 2020, and I've been working along with so many colleagues here of the Armenian Bar Association for all of this 3 years now, which is almost 3 years, unbelievable how time passed by. One of my colleagues from Argentina who's not present today, Luciana Minasian, called me to see what is that we could do as the crimes were coming out in many, the atrocities committed by Azerbaijani soldiers. And I'm not going to get into the discourse, the Aliyev discourse or the discourse of officials who have a genocidal nature, but that's beyond going into that. Thank you, Patrick. I'll answer. No, it's not. I'll answer after I finish. So when the crimes were started to come out publicly in a lot of channels of social media, for example, like Telegram was one very common, Twitter or Facebook, we started thinking what would be the venues. Argentina has open universal jurisdiction for other cases. One of the most interesting and recent one is the Rohingya, as you might have heard. In 2019, the jurisdiction of Argentina was open for the crimes committed against the Rohingya, possibly genocide, from 2017 onwards, although history goes back, and it's the same with Artsakh, or the Armenians, the ethnic Armenians of Artsakh. History goes a lot back, and it was a wonderful presentation of Artsakh, but the persecution of Armenian goes beyond also the state of Artsakh. So there are some similarities. In any case, the Rohingya was one of the jurisdiction open, and it's under investigation in Argentina at the moment. Another interesting case open in Argentina in 2010 was for the crimes committed during Franco's dictatorship in Spain. There were no investigations carried out in Spain, and no possibility of such because of different internal laws in Spain, and the same in the case of Myanmar and the Rohingya. Those are at the moment open investigations within the Argentine judiciary. So one of the possibilities we analyzed is to open a universal jurisdiction case. So in 2021, in June 2021, we filed the claim based on this principle in the courts, in the federal courts of Argentina, which are the ones I used to work in the criminal as a high criminal court rapporteur, but in the provincial system, in the state system. It's very similar, the organization, to the United States. So the jurisdiction falls within the federal jurisdiction of Argentina. We decided to open, to file a claim. The claim, we submitted another submission in 2022 because of the crimes committed during the September attack of 2022. I cannot believe the years. I'm getting mixed up a little bit because the time passes by so quickly, and unfortunately, one of the negative aspects of judicial claims is that they're very slow. So those different crimes that were submitted were based on crimes against humanity and war crimes, and they included the destruction of a cultural heritage of Armenians as well. And although genocide was not included, the claim was based on the hate towards the Armenian identity. So the idea of this claim was to prevent further crimes towards the ethnic Armenians and Armenians in Artsakh, but Armenians in general, to give voice to Artsakhis who are unable to trigger other jurisdictions because of the lack of representation they have internationally, which is something that we have to continue to discuss, because we cannot depend on countries, in just individual countries. This should be addressed internationally, as the international legal system, one of the main principles is statehood and also self-determination. So it's unbelievable that in the 21st century, we yet have very and clear unanswered questions about this. But the idea anyway was to give some representation. As that was mentioned before, a lot of the information was taken from the Ombudsman office, both in Artsakh and in Armenia, as they do collaborate, and also they collaborated with us. And the crimes, as I mentioned, were from war crimes to crimes against humanity, including the destruction of cultural heritage, based, of course, of the Internal Criminal Code of Argentina, but also on the laws that Argentina has recognized with a constitutional hierarchy, or with hierarchy of national laws within our own territory. So this is a very interesting case. It has to, of course, move forward. And as I said, it's very slow. And it has two particular, or maybe three negative aspects as well. One is Argentina does not have trials in absentia. Unfortunately, I do support trials in absentia for international crimes. That's a personal, of course, view. The second, but I think is very relevant, it's the topic of another discussion, very long discussion, but that's one of the elements. So there is a limit to the investigation and the possibility of getting to a trial, an oral trial. The other element is the distance, universal jurisdiction, whether it's triggered in Argentina or even in Europe, there is a physical distance with the territory where the crimes are committed. That's another criticism of the International Criminal Court, of course, because it sits in The Hague, and there is a physical distance, a geographical distance usually between the territories and the territories where the crimes were committed, and the nationality, of course, of perpetrators and victims, and the place where the court is located, and in this particular case, Argentina. Those are two very important elements, which of course make it difficult to gather evidence, and to, of course, the translations that go back and forth. I'm sorry, I hear an echo and I hear myself.
No, it's because I just unmuted. So many people are wanting this in absentia prosecution to go forward, especially in view of Russia.
Yeah,
So
it's actually it's actually
myself.
Oh, no problem.
I agree completely with you.
Yes, it's my topic of PhD dissertation, actually, because I think there needs to be in this particular. I mean, I don't want to go on the branches with this because I can speak for hours. That's something all Latin Americans do. The fact that in the case of Vladimir Putin now, anyway, he will never be found anywhere. He's gonna stay in Russia. So either he's tried in absentia, or he's not. Those are the options. In any case, that's one of the difficulties that we face. Other countries do have trials in absentia, and that's one of the difficulties that we face. I always say that the problem is that we don't have a retroactivity in the law. But we do have the crime, unfortunately, of enforced disappearances, of which Argentina is also, we suffered from the crime. We were very known for this crime during the last dictatorship of the 70s, but we also pushed forward the recognition of this as a crime. And that's because of Latin America, that's actually the first international instrument recognizing enforced disappearance was established, and then the international one in the UN system. But in any case, enforced disappearance is a continuous crime. So if trials in absentia are ever approved anywhere in the world, we can definitely investigate that specific crime. In any case, going back to universal jurisdiction, it's one of the venues, unfortunately, one of the very few that unrecognized territories, and therefore unprotected people. Unfortunately, human rights are very linked to citizenship, and we see this, for example, in stateless individuals as well, which there are more than 10 million in the world at the moment. So universal jurisdiction is a possibility. However, I wanted to also mention the third disadvantage it has. Of course, it depends on the economic resources, the financial impossibility of all countries to continually open a universal jurisdiction. One of the fears or discussions that arises when talking about this in the case of Argentina, and recently now also there was a claim filed for the crimes against humanity committed in Venezuela as well through universal jurisdiction in Argentina. So we see Argentina as a very good venue. People are talking about Ukraine as well. I've been having discussions also with my colleague about universal jurisdiction for the case of Ukraine. But once again, it's the economic circumstances. Argentina is a very, unfortunately, unstable economy at the moment, and that of course impacts everything, every aspect of the state, and one of those is the judiciary. So do we have enough resources to continue universal jurisdiction in Argentina, or to be so open about universal jurisdiction in Argentina? I hope we do. I hope we do have enough resources for that, but I think it's a discussion that has to be broadened in order to give a response to this unprotected communities, a better response to these unprotected communities in other areas like Germany, in other countries of the world, like Germany, and try to approve it or pass it. For example, Italy does allow trials in absentia, but has no, at the moment, fully universal jurisdiction. There is a link. Spain used to have it, investigated the crimes committed, for example, in countries in Latin America during the dictatorships. However, it has more restrictive laws now that do not allow for universal jurisdiction fully. It's kind of like partial. There has to be a link with the crime. So anyway, I'm open for questions. I think this is in all of the gaps that we find in international law. I always say that there are national systems actually that apply international law, and those can be a good response, or maybe imperfect, but at least a good response where there seems to be nothing else. Thank you.
Thank you.
Questions?
I have a question for everyone. I am unscrupulous when it comes to entertaining my students, and I hope I may call on all of you at some point in my international law class, when we approach a subject in this area, to call on you to zoom into my class and give them a real treat to hear from authentic experts and people really involved in these issues. All of us in the academy strive to bring real engagement into the classroom. And so these people have been in my classroom many times, and I've been in theirs. And one of our big endeavors in some of our international law groups is to take advantage of the new world brought about by Zoom, if not by airplanes, to bring you in reality. So this topic is just, it's so frustrating. So many of the answers are just not palpable, and we're not able to get them. And I'm taking over from Levon, to who's really the expert here. Please.
I profess no expertise at all in universal jurisdiction, but I do have two questions from Iran's presentation. One was, and both of them relate to sort of the comparisons you had made to other cases. So one was the one investigating Argentine courts investigating crimes committed during the Franco regime, and the other was about the German court hearing of the crimes committed against, I believe it was the I forget which community it was in Syria, but
Yazidi,
Yeah,
against the Yazidis.
the Yazidis committed by ISIS. So I think they raised two different questions. One is the one for the Franco one. You mentioned that there was relevant that there was no ongoing investigation in the Spanish courts. Is there that's probably something that Argentine courts can take judicial notice of, or maybe there's a process for communicating between Spanish courts and Argentine courts. Is there a process for doing that with unrecognized states, for courts from Argentina to communicate with courts of unrecognized states? And then for the one comparing the Franco case and the Yazidi case, the Franco case strikes me as one where you're in pursuing or implicating acts of a sovereign state, the Franco regime, and then whereas the Yazidis, it's ISIS. So is sovereign immunity an issue to universal to effective exercise of universal jurisdiction?
Okay, so I thank you, Levon. These are very good questions, and I love questions because they cover everything I forget to say when I do a presentation. So one thing is, for Argentina, universal jurisdiction is subsidiary. So it has to, no other case against the same people for the same crimes has to be open anywhere, right? Not anywhere, but in the territory where the crimes were committed. There can be cases, I'll put the example of the Rohingya, for example. There is a case for genocide in the ICJ, and there is a universal jurisdiction case in Argentina, and there is also a case for deportation in ICC, right? In the ICC, in the International Criminal Court, for deportation of the Rohingya as a crime against humanity. Argentina, because Myanmar is not a party to the ICC, but Bangladesh, where the Rohingya were located, is a part to the ICC. So all of this, when one analyzes the situation, one has to determine a lot of things. So, so that it's not incompatible for Argentina to open an investigation against for genocide against the Rohingya community in Argentina, right? So it can be for the same crime or the same act against the same people, because it could violate the principle of ne bis in idem. If other countries doing internally, as let's say Sweden would be investigating the case, eventually whichever case advances more will close, right? But we look at it in Argentina's jurisdiction, looks at international venues and at the territories where the crimes were committed. So in the case of Artsakh, it's a little bit complicated because internationally Artsakh, and this is, I always clarify, this is not my position, including in our claim, I put the Republic of Artsakh, and then of course we mentioned Nagorno-Karabakh, the history of it, but Argentina and self-determination are another complicated case because of the Falkland and Malvinas situation, so I don't want to get into that self-determination. So in the case of Artsakh, it's internationally recognized as part of Azerbaijan, right? So Azerbaijan is not investigating crimes committed against Armenians, ethnic Armenians within their territory or within what internationally is recognized as their territory, right? Meaning Artsakh. So Argentina can open its jurisdiction. There is no problem with that, as long as we have sufficient information to acknowledging that there is no other open investigation. One of the problems that we face in Argentina, however, is, again, the universal jurisdiction. It's recognized in the Constitution. It's a principle recognized in the Constitution, and it's a principle recognized in different treaties, like the 1949 Geneva Convention or the Convention on Enforced Disappearances as well, that Argentina gives constitutional hierarchy, right? But it's not regulated within our criminal code. So there's no clear procedure within Argentina's criminal system to what steps should be followed for triggering universal jurisdiction. So it's a little bit through the experience of previous cases and the experience of a particular case, in this case, the case for the protection of Artsakis. And I don't want to give too many details because this is a public event. So that is something that we are learning, unfortunately, with the process, and that makes, of course, the process very slow. When you mention the issue of sovereign immunity, that could bring, and here is where I mentioned before in the beginning of my presentation, is where politics could interfere, of course. Argentina would issue an arrest warrant if necessary against any, in the case of Franco's dictatorship, the interesting part is that perpetrators are dead. So Argentina triggers its jurisdiction, and as an investigative sort of truth trial seeking jurisdiction. This is a practice that Argentina started in the 90s when it could not investigate the crimes committed during the dictatorship. It's a very complicated aspect. I could go into that, but we do have truth trials which are in the criminal jurisdiction, which seek to determine the truth, because it's an obligation for Argentina according to the human rights treaties within the Inter-American system, and also the different orders of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in the cases against Argentina. We have an obligation to investigate what happened with a specific human right violation, who is the perpetrator, who is the victim, the circumstances, etc. That's called the right to truth. And therefore, Argentina is obliged to do so within the judiciary. And that's why in this particular case, even if individuals are dead, we can carry truth trials within the criminal system. This is what recently happened last year with the massacre against indigenous communities that occurred in 1924, if I'm not recalling incorrectly the name. So the cases are very different, as you mentioned, Levon, and of course the political implication of the cases are very, very different, because in the case of Spain, we most likely won't have Argentina as a political entity, won't have issues with Spain because of the case, as a lot of Spanish individuals and even members of the government might be supportive of any sort of investigation, right? And a lot of the perpetrators, or most of the perpetrators, are dead, right? But it's different when there is, of course, international relations with a particular country, and that could, of course, harm maybe the political relations of Argentina with that specific country. Argentina's judiciary has shown to be very independent from the politics. So in the particular cases of universal jurisdiction, I don't want to talk about internal cases, but as per the universal jurisdiction cases, Argentina's judiciary and the prosecution has always been very keen in opening cases, and even in thinking of, because we haven't reached to that point, of course, issuing arrest warrants or any other form of communication to perpetrators to accuse individuals of international crimes. So sovereign immunity
I'm going
could
to have
be.
to ask, if you can, we have about 8 minutes left. So if you wanted to wrap up, Irene or Irene,
Yes.
that would be good.
Thank you. Iran is much better. Thank you, Patrick. Yes. So what I mean is, we would have to, as in the issue of immunity, we would have to, sovereign immunity, we would have to see what the impact is in the politics. But Argentina's judiciary, in terms of universal jurisdiction, has shown to be very open into, or let's say supportive of opening the cases and having the possibility of investigating even high rank officials within different governments.
That's a brilliant presentation. Thank you so much.
My
And
pleasure. Thank you
So
all.
much of this is unclear, but what is definitely clear is that we will have to organize a panel like this next year where we can spend more time to develop the progress or lack of it in this area and geographically and in others. I hope we can draft a nice analysis of this, craft some good scholarship. It's truly an intriguing topic. Perhaps we should close by asking Robert and as the real expert here and everyone else, what is the future? Of course, it's an impossible question, but what is your perspective on the future?
Thank you. Yes, when we talk about our, we call ourselves as irreparable optimists. We still hope that the international law, especially when it comes to protection of fundamental human rights, will be less politicized, as it was mentioned by Irene and everyone here, and more toward and more human-oriented. Despite that, of course, we understand that, especially after the 2020 and what's going on today, that the law of the jungle is still there. So I think we're moving towards a kind of a symbiosis of our own ability to protect our rights, both as a democracy, as a bureaucracy, in a good sense, as an army, as an economy. At the same time, of course, we realize that the world, the international community, should be moving from this medieval era approaches towards the international system, which would provide any person, irrespective of its nationality or belief or religion or whatever it is, to have protection with political tool set, which the humankind has been fighting to develop for centuries. At the same time, of course, we understand that the physical security remains a priority, and even see that the UN, as we all see, is not a guarantee that your fundamental human rights will be provided. So with all that, we take our lessons and we continue moving ahead with the pace that we can.
May I ask a question? Because
Please speak in.
it's such a optimistic view of the, and I have to tell you, yesterday I sat with this fantastic presentation about war crimes. And the example that we were looking at there was with regard to Ukraine and Russia. And every possible sanction described against the Russians that could be implemented was. And yet here we are. Ukraine is still trying to defend itself. And even with all of the assistance and all of the, Ukraine being a recognized country, it's still in the midst of fighting a war. It's not, and so I don't have the same optimism that is, and I think I'm probably the only non-international lawyer in the room, but to me, it seems like these international mechanisms have been put into place just to make us feel good about the world. There's no real practical outcome of any of these requirements that have been put into place.
Yes, there is. There's the famous quotation that is so true, that most of the people follow most of international law most of the time, right? And that leads us to the observation that what if we didn't have the imperfect international law that we do? They are bumpers that steer most of the international community, without which we would be back in World War III or whatever. That is an optimistic view, but what would we talk about? My students complain a lot about the United Nations. Yeah.
Right.
Why does France have a veto in the United Kingdom, right? But what if we didn't have it? Help me here.
Well, I mean, specifically the UN, it marked sort of the first step in the shift away from the Westphalian system, because there was a predecessor to the UN, the League of Nations, and although they sort of, advanced international justice, it was international justice between states. It was not states being accountable to individuals.
We've come so far.
Yeah. So and I think the world history reflects moments of progress and moments of regress. And currently we are in a moment of regress, and where every state essentially is receding in terms of its willingness to participate and promote international justice, rather than administering sort of domestic brands of.
And some would say even national justice.
Right. But I think for every step back, there's communities that recognize this is a step back, and they fight harder. And then some days I share Robert's optimism, other days I don't. But yeah, no, it's
I think Friedrich had a comment. Excellent. Any further comments or additions, Leah? It's certainly an intriguing topic, and we owe this to you for organizing this. And we really, and you and the Armenian Bar Association.
panelists for doing the bulk of the work in preparing.
But really, we'll be in touch with two things. One, that we must expand this for next year. The topic is too good. I mean, too poignant for sure, and too relevant. And then we will obviously be in touch about some submissions of some writing, and we'll see how we can focus and get that going. It's just, I mean, it's very vain, but it's a professor's dream to be swimming in these waters, although it's not happy. Levon,
I mean, it's noon. I don't want to take away from your lunches. Thank you so much for joining today, for joining the discussion, for participating. It's a topic that's very important.
Can I say no? Sorry, Levon. If anyone wants,
Sorry.
sorry, can you hear me?
I can hear you now. Yeah.
I feel free to give. I'm sorry, I'm not there. I really wish I could talk to everyone afterwards, but if anyone wants my email, feel free, Levon, to give my email to everyone. I mean, I'm more than happy to be in touch with anyone who wants to be in touch.
we will be in touch.
Yes,
We didn't
thank
get
you,
a chance
Patrick.
to
Yes.
do formal introductions, but Irene is both a human rights advocate in Argentina and a professor of international law. So, well, whatever your angle of interest, please, I'd be happy to connect you.
Thank you. We are adjourned.
Thank you all.
And a comment from the audience on Zoom. Thank you. A really wonderful presentation by all.